But I always go back to, and we can go back and forth on divine simplicity, and we can talk about the nature of the Trinity and all these things. I think where I come from fundamentally, I think that's an interesting debate. I think that's something we could talk about. But I think when we get down to it, it really comes down to what is in the Scripture, which is to say that the Roman Church, the Latin Church, the Catholic Church has Peter. And I really find it hard to say that you can be an Eastern Orthodox person, that you could still be a Christian, when there's so much in the Scripture which says that you have St. Peter and the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, as supreme over the other bishops. And so I think when you look at that, I mean, it could be an interesting thing that we could go down that avenue, and we could say that does divine simplicity, because you don't have that personal relationship with God, you don't have that theosis, could that lead to, in some way, shape, or form, secularism or atheism? I think that's an interesting tract, but I think it gets away from the fundamental point, point there in Catholicism, which is that Peter was given the keys. Peter was given the keys. He was the rock on which the church was founded. And I don't see how you could be a Christian. I don't know how that would be not heretical if your church does not include that first church and Rome in particular. So I know that's not, I don't use all the technical language. I know, and I respect your knowledge greatly, but that's really where I come at it from.
Okay, well, two things I would say to that is that one, reply to the issue of the claim that, well, if I go to the Bible, I can find these Petrine texts, and that therefore this kind of vindicates the totality of Roman Catholicism. One problem with that is that a lot of times, now you may not be making this argument, but I made this argument as a Roman Catholic apologist, and many Roman Catholic apologists still make this argument. They will say that the only way that we know what the Bible is ultimately because some councils, but ultimately Rome made the decision of what the canon of Scripture would be. This is a very common Catholic argument, and I don't deny that there's an aspect to which absolutely the Church in time confirmed what the canon would be. I would deny that it was completely the decision of Rome, but it's very often made clear by Roman Catholic apologists that the papacy confirms the Scriptures. So, but what I'm hearing is that at the same time, the Roman Catholic apologists will say the papacy confirms the Scriptures, but to prove the papacy, I can go to the Scriptures and find a few verses here and there, and that therefore I can extrapolate the universal jurisdiction, both spiritual and temporal, of a Pontifex Maximus, universal monarch for the office of Peter, a bishop in the early church. To me, that's very strained and circular. Now, I do believe that ultimately we can talk about questions of ultimate presuppositions or worldview beliefs being circular, because at a certain point you're gonna hit the highest authority, and it's going to be circular. But the problem is that in Roman Catholic theology and epistemology, they have a view that's called classical foundationalism. Now, this is a term that's given later in time, but it's essentially the idea that you can't have circular arguments. You have to have a kind of a foundation, and then a self-evident maxim, and then you kind of build on that, and then you build on that, and then you build on that. So for most Catholic theologians, it's been things like the law of non-contradiction, or this kind of thing. A equals A, modus ponens. These are self-evident maxims, and then we can build our system on top of that. So what I'm saying is that the problem with that view, Nick, is that there's you can't on the one hand have the Pope being the reason that we know what books make up the canon, and at the same time going to the canon of Scripture and saying that this is what justifies the universal jurisdiction of the Bishop of Rome. So, and one other point to your argument is that Peter was in Antioch. And so if I attend an Antiochian Orthodox church, that descends from Peter. Mm-hmm. So in other words, there's not in our position, there's not any specific reason why Rome has a universal jurisdictional primacy beyond it just having a lot of honor. And in fact, when you read the ecumenical councils, we would absolutely agree with the Petrine see being given primacy in terms of Peter was called the Coryphaeus of the apostles, the mouthpiece of the apostles in the Greek tradition. So, but we don't believe that necessarily means that he has like this universal jurisdiction over all of the church, precisely because when you read the book of Acts, you don't see that. You see Peter going to the council in Jerusalem in Acts 15, and it's James that presides at that council because it's in Jerusalem, and James is the bishop of Jerusalem. We see Paul rebuking Peter. We see Peter basically submitting to the decisions of the council in Jerusalem. And so my final point would just be, look, if the Petrine position of Vatican I was literally what the scriptures taught, then why don't we see that process and that modus operandi actually happening in scripture? We don't see that. We see conciliarism. We see, let's have a council, let's get together, and because the whole church has the fullness of the Spirit. The whole church has the mind of Christ. It's not just one bishop that has that. The whole church has it. They have the fullness in the Eucharist. Therefore, we don't need a supreme Pontifex Maximus. And the fact that the Orthodox Church has continued to exist after the schism with plenty of people shows we don't need that. It's not necessary. If it was absolutely necessary, why didn't we just completely obliterate, like the Protestants, into a million schisms?
Well, I mean, to answer the first point, I'm not making the argument that you argued in the first point, that because the Catholic Church decided what was canon, I'm not making that argument. I'm making the argument based on scripture that Peter was given this primacy, he was given this authority. So for the first point, I'm not really going to answer that because that's not really my position. But to the second point, and sort of to answer that last part, just because it's the most fresh, you say, why in terms of Orthodoxy are we not fragmented into a number of different churches and everything? Well, I think it kind of is it not? I mean, you have the Greek Orthodox Church, you have the Russian Orthodox Church. I mean, there really isn't, if you go in the phone book, you can look, and there are a number of different Orthodox sects, whereas, Catholic Church, you just have one, right?
Okay, but that's a little bit of a slippery slope here, because first of all, the Orthodox Church operates the same way that the church operated for the first millennium. So there were always national churches. Anytime the apostles went out, when they converted people, what they would do is they would translate the scriptures and the liturgy into the vernacular. And that's why you have these historic churches going all the way back to these nations. Now, it wasn't always a whole nation, but eventually over time, under the imperium, you would have, for example, at an ecumenical council, the bishops of the various nations would meet and make decisions. They would debate, so forth and so on. So the fact that there are vernacular local liturgies, and even the Roman Catholic Church accepts 16 different vernacular liturgies as part of her liturgy, shows that just saying, well, because there's a Russian Orthodox Church and because there's a Greek Orthodox Church, that doesn't mean that there's necessarily a split or division, because Roman Catholicism has that as well. Secondly, I would say there have always been disagreements and dissensions in the church. You see this in the book of Acts. You see this all throughout the first millennium of the church. So dissensions and divisions and a whole nation even going into schism, that's all throughout the councils. But I would just repeat the words of Pope Benedict Ratzinger in Introduction to Christianity, where he says for the first millennium of the church, they operated in a conciliar fashion and not according to the Vatican I papal monarchy position. So even at Vatican II, you've had this recognition, and I'm not a fan of Vatican II. I think it was ultimately kind of a dismantling of the Western tradition, which is sad. But I'm saying you had this tacit agreement that, we need more collegiality, we need more conciliarism, because maybe we went too far with our ultramontane position at Vatican I. But again, to your first point, you in that argument may not have argued that we know the canon because of the papacy, but this is almost always the Roman Catholic apologist position. And as far as I know, I've never heard a Roman Catholic apologist deny that they know what the canon is because of the papacy's final decision. I mean,